So the title of this fourth section of the EuroMemo 2023 is Global Disorder and its Repercussions on the Future of the EU. Slide 2, please. So the concept of polycrisis has already been mentioned. What I would like to stress here in this context is the consequences, political and security consequences of some of the developments of the world economy that we've been seeing, which can be understood, for instance, in terms of securitization and the weaponization of interdependence. The war in Ukraine is a case in point. I will briefly explain how. And there's also a tendency for the world to be increasingly divided into two or more antagonistic groupings as well. Our argument is that at the heart of these developments lies a world economy that exhibits uneven growth. There is economic growth, there's population growth, and there's also some per capita economic growth measured in GDP terms. Of course, we all agree that GDP is a very bad measure, particularly when we are thinking about well-being or security of people and so on. But what also matters from the global political economy and security point of view is the unevenness of growth processes and how those tend to be self-reinforcing as well, and that they have major political and other consequences. As do many economic imbalances in the world economy, including in trade relations, in monetary relations. There are financial instabilities that have major consequences, and one of the key turning points in the history of the world was the 2008 and 9 global financial crisis that can be seen as a kind of a saddle point also in political developments as well. And then there have been various contradictory responses to all these processes by states that tend to see these processes only from a particular point of view rather than from the point of view of the whole. There's also another aspect, and this is particularly evident in the case of the EU, as we've already seen from Marika's presentation. The growth rates of growth in the EU have been very, very low. In 15 years, there has been less than 10% of economic growth in the EU and Euro area. And this is also more generally the case in the OECD world in particular, and some parts of the world economy. But because of the unevenness of growth, there are some other parts that have been growing relatively fast, particularly East Asia and South Asia. So this is a very much part of the story. In slow-growing context, what happens is that the accumulated inherited wealth tends to grow faster than production and income. And this has also consequences from the political point of view. It leads to changing power relations in society, and particularly in a world where we have separate territorial states and a liberal world economy where capital can move fairly freely. Can I have the third slide, please? So when we look at the historical development since the late 1990s, or from the early 1990s as well, it is worth stressing, even though this is also self-evident in a way, that the world economy functions through a system of separate sovereign states. And so in addition to the inherent dynamics of the liberal world economy, we have also the intra and interconnected dynamics of the interstate system that is based on the logic of the state or reason of the state, or raison d'etat, if you like. And when we look at the end of the Cold War and the immediate aftermath, when there was a lot of euphoria about the prospects for peace, and many people were thinking in Fukuyama terms as the end of history and so on, the states never stopped worrying about their security after the end of the Cold War. And one of the continuities had to do with the nuclear deterrence. So as we know, Russia inherited the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union, and throughout the 1990s and 2000s until today, I mean, there has been this deterrence in place between the United States and Russia in particular. There are other nuclear powers as well, but those are the two most important. in security dynamics of the 2000s and 2010s, has also emerged from critical responses to what could be called the one-sidedness of the neoliberal and unipolar world order. And there have been all kinds of systems of double morality at play. And there has been also this idea that some countries, and particularly the United States, is above the law, international law, but is a good actor, so it can, or benevolent actor that can act in the interest of the whole, so it can become the police of the world and so on and so forth. But this created double standards that the many other countries, not least Russia, started to find increasingly unacceptable. From a security perspective, when we have these systems of uneven growth and imbalances in the world economy, and also changing financial positions, these can be very easily perceived from a reason of the state perspective in terms of relative state power. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why economic imbalances very easily lead to antagonisms between states, including, for instance, trade wars. And just witness the China-US trade war that has been going on for some time now. And then is the process of securitization, defining issues as existential concerns for the states or communities, and thereby justifying or legitimizing exceptional measures and territorializing issues and so on and so forth. And this can include concerns about economic growth and its presuppositions, including understood in terms of trade surplus and deficit, investment, scarce resources, and various things as well, given the ecological problems of the world economy. Next slide, please. The gridlock and decline of global governance. Sorry, it's number 4. Thanks. Because of these developments, but I'm trying to summarize very complex processes here. But there's a common perception that the systems of global governance started to decline in the 2000s, and this has continued until today. And some researchers call this the gridlock of global governance, including Thomas Hale and David Held in their book that was called Gridlock, and the subtitle was Why Global Cooperation Fails When it is Needed the Most. Growing, they explain this in terms of various changes since the Second World War, and particularly also since the heyday of the US hegemony, growing multipolarity. So there are other growth centers in the world economy and the other growing powers, harder problems, institutional inertia and fragmentation. Harder problems also include the fact that many of these attempts to govern the world economy increasingly the concerns what previously was considered to be domestic politics, and they start to try to regulate those in various ways. But this is, well, let me say this first. There are many global problems, and one of the arguments is that if these problems are left unresolved, they may actually make those very problems that are left unresolved, even worse. And they can also generate social conflicts, including among great powers as well. So one of the expectations of this gridlock argument was precisely the rise of great power rivalry and increasing securitization in the global system. However, this gridlock argument is only part of the story. The problem is deeper and involves disintegrative tendencies and contradictions in the global political economy. And there are many aspects of this, and I can only mention here one very important. The fallacy of composition is typically based on the attempt to generalize the perspective of one particular actor, which is not actually generalizable. So, for instance, in the context of world trade, if states are trying to create surplus for them, and if many of them are doing it simultaneously, very often they end up in a very contradictory situation, because deficits and surpluses, they always cancel out. I mean, their total sum is always zero. And so it is impossible for them all to do that simultaneously. If they try to do that through internal devaluation, for instance, I mean, this leads to less effective demand, not only domestically, but also declining export markets for the others. So there are tendencies toward stagnating developments that are based on the logic of the interstate system. Now, these disintegrative tendencies are then also manifest in various emerging political ideologies and movements as well, and particularly the rise of nationalist, populist, and often authoritarian responses that began in the 1990s and have been growing ever since. And particularly the global financial crisis was a world historical saddle point in this regard. And one could argue from a kind of a rational reading of history point of view that this induced further stasis and regression in the system. Now, even moderately nationalist policies have the tendency to follow myopic, self-regarding policies in the interstate fields, and this tends to make cooperation more difficult and increases the likelihood of conflicts and their securitization. Next slide, please. So here we come to the war at the heart of Europe. So one can argue from this point of view that and we do, that global disorder has now culminated in a full-scale war at the heart of Europe. And this is only one instance of the problems that we are seeing in the world. Think about the Middle East or the Arabic world. Actually, the most devastating conflict in 2022 was not in Ukraine, it was in Yemen. But anyway, so we have this conflict at the heart of Europe. And the processes leading to this war, they involve many of those developments that are very briefly here summarized in the global political economy. It has involved the insecurity dynamics of the 2000s and 2010s and various processes of securitization that is also internally and externally connected to processes of de-democratization as well, not least in countries like Russia. So when we look at these processes from the point of view of economic sanctions, and we have a text box on sanctions that actually highlights it in a way that has not been particularly common in public discussions. The era against sanctions against Russia started already in 2012. This was related to an imprisonment of a particular lawyer. The process started already back in 2009 in Russia. The sanctions started to deepen in 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the low-intensity warfare in eastern Ukraine, and obviously this exploded in 2022. Now, what has happened from the EU point of view is that its attempts to reduce, and quite successfully actually reducing, energy imports from Russia has backfired. And this has contributed to rising inflation and the energy crisis in Europe. Obviously, the energy prices are going down again, but nonetheless, I mean, this has in a major way contributed to the rising levels of inflation. Some analysts, some pundits actually question whether the effects of sanctions have been more significant or harsher on Russia than on the EU. And some even talk that looking at this from a mutual point of view about the war of attrition. When we look at the sanctions from the US point of view, it is clear that many US firms have actually benefited, and including also those that belong to the military-industrial complex. But on the other hand, the sanctions have also induced deglobalization and contributed to further gradual de-dollarization of the world economy. So it actually implies a shift away from the centrality of the United States and and dollar in the world economy. Now, the main problem of this war in Ukraine, of course, lies in the possibility of further escalation. And in particular, nuclear war is now on the horizon in a way that it hasn't been since the early 1980s, or perhaps some people claim since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Now, this seems to give almost like a Kantian imperative to de-escalate the conflict. So from a moral perspective, we need to do something. And this something is obviously the beginning of some sort of peace negotiations in Ukraine. And there are plenty of good possibilities about how this could be done without actually rewarding Russia for its invasion. The role of the United Nations should be emphasized and so on and so forth. However, we argue in this EuroMemo that the mere peace agreement alone would be insufficient to reverse the ongoing disintegrative tendencies both in the EU and globally. And next slide, please. So when we look at things from the point of view of the EU in the world system, we can say a few things as a kind of a conclusion of this analysis. And again, I would like to stress that this necessarily summarizes a lot of and simplifies a lot of the very complex realities and processes that we are seeing. But anyway, so we can conclude that the EU, from the internal point of view, continues to, if you like, sleepwalk towards further disintegration, if not toward outright catastrophe. So we have the new era of stagflation at hand, but it seems that we are also heading towards new rounds of austerity across the EU. And this has very predictable consequences. Now, while the EU faces internal opposition to further integration, including in terms of developing common fiscal policy, as we remember, the standard EuroMemo demand is to at least have at least a budget of 5% of the GDP of the EU, and this is unlikely to be realized when we have a major opposition to any further integration in the EU. And this is coming from two directions, populist nationalists, and also from the so-called frugal member states, in a rather or somewhat different ways, but nonetheless. At the same time, despite these tendencies, the EU is searching for strategic autonomy, and the possibilities of realizing that are dependent on the circumstances, how things evolve. The effects of the war in Ukraine on the EU-US relations have been ambiguous. On the one hand, the EU has been increasingly subordinated to the US hegemony and become part of the, or many of the things have not been articulated through NATO. But there have also been new emerging complaints about some of the consequences of the new developments and the way the United States seems to be benefiting from them. Now, one of the consequences of these global developments has been that the US-China conflict that has also the trade war as a key component has been now extended to EU-China relations as well. And that's a very much part of the process of the world being divided into two different camps, if that's the right term. So there's one possible way the EU can find unity without actually building more democratic and social, fiscally more meaningful, ecologically more sustainable structures, and that's by way of militarizing the EU. And this scenario about the disciplinary and militarized EU has become more likely as mutually supportive circumstances are now coinciding and coalescing. And this is particularly true if a Republican candidate wins the next US elections. So what we might be seeing in the later part of the 2020s is EU unity through securitization and common enemies. It might even involve some military Keynesianism as well. And then the last slide, please. So what are the consequences from a global point of view? as already explained, these contradictions, these economic paradoxes, and so on and so forth, are in no way confined to Europe. And the struggles of income distribution are taking place in the world over. At the same time, the idea of competitiveness, for instance, is something that has been generalized across the world economy. Now, if the EU acts in a way that it tries to increase its competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the world, this could only happen at the expense of other countries and overall global demand. And this is a key problem. And if this is generalized, as it tends to be, I mean, this spells trouble for the world economy as a whole. The future of the EU is therefore dependent on the dynamics of this wider whole, which of course can be shaped by the EU because it is one of the major actors in the system. And also it is the only one that is not a sovereign state, at least not yet in the traditional sense, or a great power in that sense. So to summarize, at the end of the section 4, we propose some concrete proposals in addition to the peace agreement in Ukraine that cover the world economy as a whole. These include the reorganization of the world monetary system in terms of a common clearing union. It also concerns trade as well. Global taxes such as greenhouse gas tax, and worldwide public investment programs to make developments more even and sustainable. Thank you.